Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this new event organized by the Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en los Estados Unidos. This time, an event which, as is obvious, we are holding via Zoom. The talk we are holding today connects, on the one hand, topics that we have addressed before, like Mexican history, Mexican culture, or the invisibility of women. And on the other hand, topics which are new to us. For example, the Casta paintings and the representation of women through those traditional and very important activities like spinning, weaving, and sewing, which, to my knowledge, have not been addressed in any event at this research center of the Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University so far. So we're very grateful to our guest speaker for having accepted our invitation to share with us her deep knowledge of this subject as an expert on material culture as she is, and for her flexibility in the organization of this talk. Before I introduce her to you, I introduce Evelina Gužauskytė to you. Let me greet the Consul General of Mexico at Boston, Mr. Alberto Fierro, who is with us today. So thank you, Alberto. It's an honor to have you here. Evelina Gužauskytė is Associate Professor at Wellesley College, and she specializes both in her teaching and in her research in gender, race, and philosophy of language in colonial Latin American literature and visual culture, also in digital humanities, in the history of clothing and of food, and in cultural exchanges between Eastern Europe and Latin America. She teaches courses with exciting and fascinating topics such as fantasy and reality in literature, art, and multimedia in the introduction to Hispanic culture, or Afro-Hispanic and indigenous writers in Latin American literature, or female fashion in colonial Latin America, and food in Latin American literature and culture. Among her publications, I'll just mention two books. Her first book, Christopher Columbus Naming in the Diarios of the Four Voyages, a Discourse of Negotiation, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2014. And her current book that she is working on, Colonial Gaze, Local Narratives, Gender and Fashion in 18th Century New Spain Casta Paintings, a sample of which she is going to present to us today. Evelina has various articles, reviews, interviews published as well, together with those two books. But I would like to mention that she's also an expert literary translator. She has rendered into Lithuanian important canonical novels and by relevant writers, both from the English language literary system and from the Spanish language as well, such as The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Stevenson, or La Tabla de Flandes by Arturo Pérez Reverte, La Casa de los Espíritus by Isabel Allende, Sabas by Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda, or Dangerous Summer by Hemingway, and Hotel by Arthur Haley. So she's a real expert in literary translation, apart from her research on material culture and particularly in Latin America. I'll just finish by saying that her research has been variously supported financially by various institutions, such as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Ministry of Culture and Sports of Spain, the Lithuanian Ministry of Culture, and the John Carter Brown Library from Brown University. So thank you so much, Evelina. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and we're all willing to listen to you. So you have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Marta, for this very generous introduction. I'm deeply grateful for your invitation, for hosting me here. I'm grateful to the Observatorio del Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University for this very generous invitation. Of course, personally to Marta Mateo Martinez Bartolome for organizing everything flawlessly, and for all the support that Eric and Victoria have provided. Couldn't have done it without you. I'm also very grateful to all the colleagues that have actually joined us here, given that it's the last day of teaching at Wellesley College, and I know there have been a host of events and meetings, and so to see you here is really very special. I appreciate that. And I'm grateful to all the colleagues that I have worked with that are here, or will be joining later on, listening to the recording, that have provided help and feedback for this project. Finally, I should mention that this project is being sponsored in part by the John Carter Brown Library, to whom I'm also very indebted and grateful. So I will get to my presentation. I hope you will have patience to listen to it, and I'll do my best to get through the material. There's quite a lot. These images I will share with you are very dense, very full of wonderful information and links and dialogues that I will do my best to relate to you today. The purpose of this presentation is to share some thoughts related to my reading of the intersection among the representation of vestimentary arts, women as central protagonists, and mythological narratives in the three paintings from the Casta painting genre produced in 18th century Mexico, then Viceroyalty of New Spain. These are the three paintings I will be talking about, and you will see them throughout the presentation. The paintings I will analyze here each visualize distinct steps in the fabrication process of clothing, specifically spinning, sewing, and embroidering. The titles of these three paintings are, and you can see them projected, De Español y Castiza torna a Español, De Morisco y Española al vino, y De Indio y Cambuja nace Zambaiga. All three paintings were created by the Pueblan artist José Joaquín Magón, and they all belong to a single Casta painting set. My analysis today will consist of two parts. First, I will address the iconographic references in two paintings in this series that render visual women's work with the needle. That is the third panel in the series, De Español y Castiza torna Español, which depicts a castiza woman embroidering, and the sixth panel, De Morisco y Española al vino, which depicts a Spanish or Española woman sewing. In the second part of the presentation, I will address the complex visual, mythological, and narrative content encapsulated in a single image that portrays the labor of spinning, the 12th panel in the series entitled De Indio y Cambuja nace Zambaiga. I'd like to suggest in advance of the conclusions that instead of being read in the order in which they appear in the sequence, that underscores the hierarchical understanding of racial miscegenation during the colonial period, these three paintings can also be read in the order of the process of vestimentary fabrication. And so we can think that spinning is the first act that needs to happen before anything else can take place. So I reorder them according to the process of the making of the clothing. This allows me to offer a different reading of the female protagonists visualized in the Casta painting series by Magón, and in particular, their role in the suggestive delivery of mythological narratives and spirituality in images that embody cultural hybridity. Okay. A Casta painting typically shows a family that consists of a father and a mother of different racial backgrounds, as well as their offspring. Casta paintings were often produced in series or sets of 16 or 12 canvases. Occasionally, all scenes were displayed on a single canvas. The sequence in which images were displayed pretended to document the process and the outcomes of biological mestizaje, Names of different ethno-racial groups were inscribed in the label that formed part of the painting, in an effort to identify the increasingly complex categories resulting from unions among people of different racial backgrounds in Mexico or New Spain. In addition, Casta paintings include a wealth of visual information about the natural, the cultural, the agricultural products, natural, rural, and urban landscapes, flora and fauna, food items, and agricultural products, furniture and domestic items, styles of clothing, as well as tools, trades, and occupations characteristic of different socioeconomic classes in New Spain society. Over the course of the 18th century, more than 500 Casta paintings were created by known and anonymous authors, which are currently held in museum and private collections in Mexico, Spain, including the Canary Islands, the United States, and Great Britain. While the majority of the paintings were produced throughout the 18th century in Mexico, others were created in what today are Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador, but to a much lesser extent. Among the known artists that produced Casta paintings are Manuel Arellano, José Ibarra, Morlete Ruiz, Miguel Cabrera, is an example of one of the scenes created by Miguel Cabrera, Juan Rodriguez Juarez, Andrés de Islas, and some others. And then authorship of many of the paintings has not been identified. Casta paintings have been subject to different interpretations by critics that could perhaps be addressed in two very broad categories. One group has viewed Casta paintings as a window into the society and life of a racially mixed and hierarchically structured New Spain society, whether this image was true or an expression of a desire or anxiety. Another broad group of works approached Casta paintings as complex expressions of culture. Some of the earliest students of Casta paintings surveyed them in the light of their perceived ethnographic value. These scholars, working primarily during the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century, among them the anthropologist Ernest Theodore Hamney and Blanchard, have emphasized the material content of the paintings, including the portrayal of everyday domestic objects, as well as of the people of different races carrying out distinct jobs, wearing clothing indicative of their status and occupation. These scholars saw in Casta paintings works of low artistic value, the main purpose of which was to provide a visual reference, perhaps even a mnemonic tool, to the various racial categories in colonial New Spain, resulting from the intermarriages and sexual unions among individuals of three predominant races that were also associated with three continents: Black people originating from Africa, the indigenous of the Americas, and the white or Spanish people from Europe. Perhaps due to the view of Casta paintings as ethnographic illustrations rather than works of art, and the prevailing interest in religious art by art historians, the author of the most authoritative comprehensive study of all painting produced in Viceregal Mexico, Manuel Tosan, mentions the genre only in passing. Some of the more recent studies have offered new ways to approach Casta paintings. The first comprehensive catalog of Casta paintings by Maria Concepcion Garcia Saiz gave scholars an opportunity to view these paintings not as isolated occurrences, but as a visual genre, within which works showed continuity as well as stylistic shifts and transformations that had occurred over the course of the century. Calidad, a concept introduced by Magali Carrera in her book Imagining Identity in New Spain, Race, Lineage, and the Colonial Body in Portraiture and Casta Paintings, provided a productive way of moving away from viewing Casta paintings as strictly anthropological illustrations that provided a rigid nomenclature of material objects, fruits, vegetables, and people, to a much more comprehensive view of the visual genre that is built on the Casta concept as referring to, quote, one's social body as a whole, which included references to skin color, but also often encompassed, more importantly, occupation, wealth, purity of blood, honor, integrity, and place of origin, end of quote. Ilona Katsu, a prominent critic of the Casta painting genre, in her book, Casta Painting, Images of Race in 18th Century Mexico, published by the Yale University Press in 2004, has offered a multi-layered approach to understanding the Casta genre, based both on the demand for quote-unquote exotic paintings in the European market, the developments in the area of the natural sciences during the era of the Bourbon reforms, and the ability of the paintings to express what Katsu denominates as, quote, Creole pride. Katsu noted that, quote, these works were born out of the taxonomic interest characteristic of the Spanish Enlightenment, when the influence of the Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus was taking hold in Europe, end of quote. At the same time, Katsu reminds us that the most influential publication by Linnaeus, Systema Naturae, which revolutionized the study of the natural sciences, particularly biology, by introducing a framework of naming and classifying the vast diversity of plant and animal species, was first published in 1735, while New Spain artists had been painting Casta paintings for a couple of decades. Overall, Katsu has convincingly argued that the paintings were an opportunity to express Creole pride about the many things that New Spain had to offer, including a wide range of high-quality economic and cultural products, as well as luscious nature and productive agriculture. At the same time, Katsu challenges, quote, the usefulness of assigning one specific function to Casta painting, or of establishing a single collective interpretation of such an extensive body of work, end of quote. More recently, the exhibit curated by Rosario Granados at the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin, Texas, and her edited collection of essays surveyed the history of the production of fabric and clothing, including cloths and garments, used in daily life and in ceremonies of the Catholic Church across viceregal Americas. Casta paintings today can result exceptionally aesthetic and disturbingly offensive at the same time. While they represent a vision of a society that is not acceptable, it also presents multiple opportunities to gain a deeper understanding of how the society was viewed and the attempts that were made to capture and categorize the dynamic and diverse cultures of viceregal New Spain. So in this presentation, I build on scholarship from multiple disciplinary fields by Mexican, North American, and Spanish scholars, in particular in the fields of archaeology, anthropology, and sociology, which are not my areas of expertise, who have described the excavated artifacts that tell us about the pervasive presence of spinning and weaving tools throughout the area of pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica. Hence, the daily practices, customs, and traditions associated with the acts of spinning and weaving and their association primarily with women and girls. I'm also leaning on the works that explore the deep symbolic meanings of spinning and weaving in Maya and Nahua mythologies and spiritual practices, including their representations of oral traditions, early colonial written texts that relied on native informants and native artists, such as Bernardino de Sahagún's encyclopedic work about the people, history, and culture of Mexico, Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España, and visual culture, particularly drawings and codices, as well as descriptions of female deities on flat surfaces and in sculpture. The work carried out by the scholars at the research institutions in Mexico, including but not limited to la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, Museo Nacional de Antropología, and Museo Nacional del Virreinato, and the bi-monthly research journal Arqueología Mexicana, published by the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, to mention just a few, have been vital in advancing my research. While leaning on various disciplines that inform aspects of Casta paintings, my work builds on scholarship by emphasizing the mythological and cultural elements present in some of the Casta paintings. As I explore the representation of spinning, sewing, and embroidering in these chosen paintings by Mellon, and subsequently the centering of the female protagonist, I approach these paintings, first of all, as works of art that, as such, dialogue with other works of art and of visual and material culture that can be categorized by their intertextual nature and the resulting repetition of mythological narratives. Given that these narratives cannot be reduced to a single cultural origin, I refer to Homi Bhabha's concept of mimicry as I read works by José Joaquín Mellon, who, like other painters of his time, were negotiating agency and influence, intellectual and artistic movements, and local expression. So I project a little bit of information about Mellon as an artist, his biography, and his work. But there is very little known. This is more or less all that is known about his life and his work. So there's a real scarcity of information after consulting all of the sources that are available relating to art in Viceregal Mexico. More or less, these are the facts that are repeated by all scholars. Biographical information about Mellon is very scant. We do know that he was born in Puebla sometime in the first half of the 18th century. Scholars believe he likely moved to Mexico City, where he did much of his work. In his Pintura Colonial en México, Manuel Toussaint describes Mellon as a prolific artist and, quote, el más afamado del siglo XVIII, while lamenting the scarcity of known facts about his life. We do know of Mellon's very productive career as an artist, much of which consisted of paintings of religious themes that can be found in cathedrals and churches in both Puebla and Mexico City. He is also author of portraits of high ecclesiastics in Puebla, and he was commissioned to produce paintings for the triumphal arch to mark the crowning of the new monarch in Spain, Charles III, or Carlos III, in 1760. Mellon is known to have produced 2 series or sets of Casta paintings, each consisting of 16 paintings. One of them was signed by the artist in 1772. The other was initially thought to have been painted by Luis Berrueco, but it was subsequently attributed to Mellon by Garcia Sáez. While the 2 sets represent the same list of nomenclature of interracial marriages and their offspring, the details in the visual scenes and the additional commentary provided in the attributed series make these 2 sets rather distinct from one another. The 2 scenes that picture women working with the needle form part of the same set, the set that bears Mellon's signature, along with 2 other paintings that also picture some aspect of the process in the making of clothing, such as spinning yarn, cutting cloth, sewing, or mending. We also know that the set signed by Mellon was brought back to Toledo, Spain, by the Archbishop Francisco Antonio Lorenzana, and that it may have been included in the Cabinet of Natural History created by the Archbishop. I will now address the 2 canvases by Mellon that illustrate needlework, panel 3 and panel 6. The Castiza and the Española women portrayed in both of these scenes are either of Spanish or indigenous and Spanish lineage, and these images can be read in both complementary and contrasting fashions. The scene in panel 3 is one of idealized domesticity. In it, the Castiza woman, a racially mixed individual of Spanish or white and indigenous lineage, is shown engaged in embroidery or the making of bobbin lace, both activities resulting in decorative elements of garments. She's also shown assisting her child, who, based on a highly hierarchical, though purely imaginary structure of mestizaje, is considered to have, quote unquote, returned to whiteness, torna a español. The artist's choice to showcase decorative work of embroidering or making bobbin lace, somewhat unusual in the Casta painting genre, seems to send a message that prosperity and peace in the household can be cultivated through the woman's education and patience. In 18th as well as 19th century, embroidery was seen as the desired activity for both unmarried women and married housewives. And in particular for women in the middle and upper socioeconomic classes. Schools of amigas taught young ladies the basics of reading, writing, arithmetic, as well as the domestic arts, including the craft of embroidery. Such schools were open to criolla, mestiza, and indigenous girls. Schooling in such activities as embroidery, manners, prayer, and occasionally playing an instrument were viewed as the ideal preparation for marriage, especially for women in the upper and middle social classes. A woman educated in this fashion would become someone they called ángel del hogar, or an ideal housewife who served the role of supporting her husband, maintaining a peaceful household, and raising her children. The panel represents a scene from the daily life of a family represented in this idealized fashion that is consistent with the expectations of women at the time. Moreover, embroidery was done entirely by hand that could take days or months to complete. Thus, the activity became to be viewed as a testament to the woman's patience, humility, and dedication. Much of the embroidery work was done for the Catholic Church, as the priests' vestments and decorative hangings in churches were embroidered with the highest quality designs. Embroidery was also depicted in visual forms, both those that explored secular and religious themes as a symbol of femininity and domesticity. In religious art, embroidery, together with depictions of spinning and sewing, was associated with the Virgin Mary. In many ways, the next painting in Magon's series that explores the theme of fabricating clothing represents a similarly idyllic domestic scene. Here, we see a racially mixed Morisco man engaged in tailoring activities, while his Española wife and the mother of the child is depicted sewing a part of the clothing he is cutting. As a flawless mother, she simultaneously breastfeeds her young child while supporting him on her arm. This image fits in with other representations of trades and occupations that were a common feature in Casta paintings. Depictions of occupations such as a shoemaker, a water carrier, a tobacco or candle maker were common in Casta paintings, and some of them later became known as visual types that were used repeatedly by foreign travel writers and domestic illustrators. This is just another example, but there are many of these examples out there. Similarly common were scenes of domestic and outdoor activities such as cooking a chicken, preparing a pot of drinking chocolate, or selling baskets of fruits and vegetables at the market stand. Yet, in this scene in panel 6, something unusual stands out. That is the visual depiction of the woman, her posture, and the expression of her face. Garcia Sais notes the extraordinary sensibility when she writes about panel 3, with which the domestic scenes in this series by Magon are executed. Here, Garcia Sais says, quote, "The white faces and sharp noses strive to respond to the expressivity of the scene, although the gestures of the hands are most designed to capture our attention." Referring to panel 3, she writes, "The way the thread passes through the castiza's fingers while she draws it in would suffice to show the artist's talent." End of quote. Indeed, the delicate expression of the mother's hands in both paintings being discussed here communicates the artist's masterful rendition of intimacy and sensibility. In panel 6, the gentle support she provides for her young child and the understated eloquence of her modest clothes, the white color of which speaks of purity and modesty, all come together to create an image of a mother who is peaceful, caring, and nurturing. It is the masterful rendition of her facial expression, however, and in particular the artist's decision to paint her eyes as raised upwards towards the heavens in an unmistakable articulation of piety, devotion, and prayer, that introduces to this domestic scene iconographic elements that hark back to representations of the Virgin Mary in religious art. The iconography of the nursing Madonna, or Virgo lactans, in paintings in which Virgin Mary is shown breastfeeding the infant Jesus, is clearly present in this Casta painting, although breastfeeding, a topic to intense discussions at the time, would need to be explored in more depth in a separate presentation. As far as the symbolism of the Virgin Mary's eyes raised upwards towards the heavens in prayer and ecstasy, this was consistent iconographic element in images of the Assumption or the raising of Virgin Mary to the heavens. There are multiple examples of such depictions of Virgin Mary in the Americas, including, I think I get to that a little bit later, including, let's see, La Asunción, considered to be one of the most artistically achieved paintings by a New Spain artist of African and indigenous lineage, Juan Correa. Another influential New Spain artist of the 17th century, Cristóbal de Villalpando, employed the iconography of the Virgin Mary, raising her eyes upwards to the heavens in his Immaculate Conception. And unfortunately, it's really hard to get a hold of these paintings. So during a trip, when I can, I take photos. Sometimes I use images that have been reprinted in catalogs, but in some cases, in the case of Cristóbal Villalpando, the original is actually at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, but due to copyright, it cannot be copied in any fashion. So in a future iteration of this publication, I will be able to get a hold of this image. Two other paintings, one by a Spanish artist and another by a Mexican artist, will help me in my argument that the domestic scene involving a racially mixed family in Magon's painting offers an opportunity for a multi-layered approach based on several artistic and cultural traditions, rather than the Casta painting genre alone. The Immaculate Conception of Los Venerables by Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, the Spanish painter, has been recognized as an important example of the Spanish Baroque. Murillo created it in 1678, and the painting was commissioned by the Canon of Seville Cathedral and the ecclesiastical president of the Hospital de los Venerables in Seville, Justino de Neve. Painting was frequently copied by other artists. In most of the 24 versions of the Immaculate Conception that Murillo painted, the Virgin Mary is shown dressed in a white robe with a blue mantle, standing on a crescent moon, her eyes upraised towards the heaven. In the description of the painting, the staff at the Prado Museum emphasized that her clearly upward directed gaze is, quote, a clearly upward impulse that situates her in a celestial space filled with light, clouds, and angels, end of quote. And that this, another quote, was the artist's manner of combining two different iconographic traditions, the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption, end of quote. The use of the light on the face of the Castiza mother in Magon's painting resembles the use of light by Murillo. The visual diagonal created from the top right corner that moves downward to the left creates a sense of softness and purity, and it can be observed in both paintings. There are many differences as well. For example, the celestial gold background in Murillo's painting contrasts with the plain dark background in the interior space in Magon's scene, the subject of which is a humble home. Nevertheless, Magon's choice of a dark setting creates an even greater emphasis on the illuminated face and body of the breastfeeding, sewing mother. And although the Castiza is shown in the company of her presumed husband, the father of a child who is portrayed as a simple tailor, engaged in his daily labors, the domesticity of the scene need not detract us from the suggestiveness of her portrayal. To finish this section of my presentation, another image of the Assumption by the celebrated artist from Mexico City was likely an influence from Mellon's composition, and that is the Assumption of the Virgin, produced in 1719 by Antonio de Torres, and this is a Mexican artist who painted in the taller of his uncle Antonio Rodriguez, together with cousins Nicolas and Juan Rodriguez Juarez, the latter of whom produced more than one Casta painting series as well. Magon, as a painter of both religious art and Casta painting series, who was active during the second half of the 18th century, was no doubt well familiar with Antonio Torres's work, including the masterfully executed The Assumption of the Virgin. The use of intense yet soft colors, the sweet rounded face of the Virgin Mary, the intentional use of light are all elements that can be found in Magon's description of the sewing Castiza mother. The use of light and soft shadow on the fabric of the dress of the Virgin and the Castiza mother both create a sense of tangible, subtle fabric of their garments. Even Magon's decision to dress the Castiza in a white dress while spreading on the tailor's work table a sheet of intensely blue fabric, which you can see here only a little corner of, but in the full image you can see a beautiful blue fabric, which may have seen previously as an inconspicuous aesthetic choice, now appears as an element that is difficult to separate from the repeating iconography of the Virgin dressed in a white robe, enveloped by a blue mantle. I want to be conscious of time. I have another part of the presentation coming up. I conclude this part of the conversation with a question. Did Magon paint the Virgin Mary seated in the domestic surroundings of the humble tailor's home? And if he did, was there a specific model of the Virgin that he followed? And really, the answer is no. We're looking at a composite image of the sewing Castiza as a composite image, a mosaic, or perhaps a palimpsestic projection of fragments of multiple images and iconographies and representations. This composite image contains within itself multiple representations that complement one another by adding layers of meaning onto the original portrait, but at the same time, they complicate and deform any single traditional depiction of the Virgin, stretching it and creating difference. My view is that Magon's sewing and breastfeeding Castiza mother should not be read as a mass portrayal of the Virgin Mary. As I hope my analysis in these examples shows, there were several provenances and points of a dialogue, each of which points to distinct features of the painting by Magon. In other words, Magon's scene in panel 6 of the Casta painting series is not a copy of a particular portrayal of the Virgin, nor of the Virgin Guadalupe. I haven't talked about the Virgin of Guadalupe, but I just want to say that that's also not a direct reference. Instead, it is the artist's inspired rendition of a domestic scene of members of New Spain society that integrates allusions, attributions, and reflections that give the scene a more multi-layered cross-cultural depth and meaning. This artist's creation of protagonists that portray New Spain society, its everyday life and labors and dedications, is elevated further by the artist's ability to subtly reference the most venerated and idealized mother in Christianity, the Virgin Mary. At the same time, Magon's goal in the scene is not to depict the Virgin Mary herself, but rather to allow the viewer to see her divine reflections in the everyday acts of work, dedication, and care of an ordinary working and racially mixed family. And I refer in my written version to Homi Bhabha's concept of mimicry that emphasizes difference through repetition. So we can come back to that point later on. Okay, so I would like to now at least spend a little bit of time talking about this very, very wonderful painting that is a separate panel in the series by Magon. Having addressed the presence of the spiritual elements in the daily scenes of sewing and embroidering, I will dedicate the second half of this presentation to the third canvas by Mellon that centers on the very early stage in the process of producing clothing or textile, the spinning of thread, in panel number 12. The Indio y Cambuja nace Sambaiga. As I hope we were able to see in the series of the previous two paintings, those secular in nature correspondences and dialogues with and reflections of other artworks, including religious art and its iconographies, should not be excluded. I'd like to propose that the third painting in the sequence is a particularly complex image that can only be understood in the larger context of contemporary art history and visual culture, as well as the intersection of ancient Nahua and Maya, ancient Greek and Roman, and to a much lesser extent, Christian mythologies. Read in this way, the painting opens doors to reading the representation of a racially mixed female protagonist as one whose racial complexity is expressed and elevated through the complexity of cultural narratives. In Magon's painting 12, the Indio Cambuca nace Sambaiga, we see a family engaged in the labor of processing raw material, likely cotton. And I just happened to be traveling to Mexico recently, and this is the Museo de las Culturas in Oaxaca, an absolutely wonderful museum. And this is a display of raw cotton at the museum. And I thought it was pretty neat how the cotton and the bowls seem to resemble the cotton in the painting. This is, by the way, the beautiful view of the museum itself. The woman labeled as Cambuja, that's the mother, is pictured at the center of the scene. She stands next to a wooden spinning wheel as she holds up a thin thread with her left hand. She is wearing a corseted dress in blue and white, laced with red string. A red kerchief is tied around her neck, and a sizable chiqueador, a marker of beauty, is visible on her right temple. The décolleté of her blouse has a detail of ruched fabric, and a modest striped rebozo in earth colors, a traditional shawl worn by indigenous and mestiza women, is draped around her shoulders. She wears a simple pair of earrings, and unspun raw cotton wraps around her raised left arm in a spiral. The second half of the painting is occupied by the Indio father and the Sambaiga daughter. The Indio man holds up a tool for measuring the weight of the spun yarn arranged into a loosely coiled skein as he prepares it for being sold in the market. The Sambaiga daughter is shown loosening and fluffing the raw cotton to get it ready for being spun by her mother, a task viewed as appropriate for a young girl that combined play with teaching the basic skills of spinning and weaving. So it's impossible to look at this image of the racial and mixed woman who is a descendant, or at least in part, from indigenous ancestors, who is portrayed wearing an indigenous rebozo, the result of the very spinning and weaving she's shown engaged in, and not think of the ubiquitous presence and culturally deep meaning of spinning and weaving in indigenous pre-Hispanic and colonial cultures of what is today Mexico. This in itself is a very large topic, and I will only underscore some key points to be explored further in the written version of this paper. Spinning as well as weaving were labors associated with women and girls in both viceregal New Spain and pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica. Spinning and weaving tools, including spindles and whorls, and so this terminology may not be fully familiar. So what you see here are what are called whorls. They were used to provide weight for the spindle so that it could spin appropriately. These objects have been found in archaeological sites across Mesoamerica. In Mesoamerica, spinning and weaving were ancestral activities central for the economy, considered as having deep connotations with the sacred and the divine. These activities were practiced almost exclusively by women, and they were associated symbolically with the realm of the feminine. Girls were taught spinning and weaving from a young age. According to ancient traditions, spinning and weaving tools would be placed near a newly born girls as a sign of their future labors. At birth, infants born female would be gifted tools of work considered appropriate for women, namely spindles, in Spanish, usos, or malacates, coming from the Nahuatl word malacat, and machetes de telar. Bernardino de Sahagún writes, quote, si era hembra la que se bautizaba, aparejábanla con todas las alhajas mujeriles que eran aderezos para tejer e hilar como uso, lanzadera, su petaquilla y vaso para hilar. End of quote. Moreover, spinning and weaving were understood as symbolic acts. The circular motion of the spindle and its gradual thickening with thread has been compared to pregnancy. So here we see a recently married woman spinning cotton using a handheld spindle and whorl, malacatl. Malacatl is a Nahuatl word that means to spin around. And it is a word that's used for the round piece, usually made from clay, which served as a weight for the lighter spindle that was made of wood or bone, and that was used for winding yarn or thread that was being spun. Most whorls were decorated with symbols that frequently related to femininity, cosmos, and sexuality. The movement associated with the ascending and descending of spindle was associated with cosmic forces related to the earth. The moving spindle was understood as a metaphor for the cosmos, but also as a sexual metaphor. The whorl represented the fertile earth penetrated by the vertical axis of the spindle. This was followed by the thickening that was seen as comparable to pregnancy. The forming of the skein of yarn around the spindle that grew bigger, thicker, and rounder with each turn as the new yarn was directed through the spinner's fingers meant pregnancy and the birth of a new life. And then finally, this is just one example, but there are several or many perhaps examples of different deities, female deities in pre-Hispanic mythologies of the Nahuas and the Mayas, including deities such as Ixchel, Xochiquetzal, Tlazol, Teotl, Ixcuina. It's a very, very complex deities, and I cannot enter into the complexity, but many of them are associated with fertility, beauty, renewal, and spinning and weaving. So this is absolutely fascinating. And here we see an image from the Florentine Codex of Tlazolteotl in a pretty European fashion, in which she's represented with two spindles and unspun wool on her headdress, and ear decorations of unspun wool as well. And there, like I mentioned, there are other images of other female deities that are represented in this fashion. The significance of spinning as contextualized with the pre-Hispanic Nahua mythology and culture is relevant also because of the identity of the man portrayed in the scene as an Indio or indigenous, as within the Casta society, the identity of the spouse, especially female spouse, was often determined in part by the identity of her male spouse. On the other hand, the identity of the female spinner as an individual of mixed racial background is one that includes lineage of all three major races, Spanish or Criolla, Black, and Indigenous, and her attire that includes both garments from Nahua and those of European traditions, pulls our interpretation in at least those two directions. So now the last piece of this talk. The final part of the reading of Magon's 12th panel will take me across the Atlantic. As in the cases of the previous two paintings, are there artistic dialogues of intertextuality that can elucidate the Casta painting scene? Given Magon's activity as a religious artist and the creator of painted scenes for the Triumphal Arch in honor of Charles III, which were commonly based on mythological narratives from ancient and Greek Roman worlds, are there paintings that can further inform our reading? Looking for religious paintings that dialogued with Magon's scenes of sewing and embroidering meant leafing through hundreds of paintings of Virgin Mary, asking yourself what works of art from New Spain, Peruvian, Italian, Netherlandish, and Flemish traditions portray the act of spinning in a way that may elucidate Magon's pictorial choices, only a handful of images come to mind. So the Virgin spinning as a child in the Peruvian tradition, or perhaps the portrait of a Nusta that is depicted in a painting from the viceregal period as holding a spindle in her left hand, and a handful of Flemish or Netherlandish paintings of women spinning that don't bear a particular resemblance. Only one work of art stands out in its ability to capture not just the act of spinning itself, but its implications for the way we think about creativity, authority, and defiance. And that is Las Hilanderas. Las Hilanderas by Diego Velázquez has been interpreted as consisting of three distinct yet closely interrelated visual lanes. I may skip the detailed description of the painting. I think it's a familiar painting to all. I can summarize briefly that, of course, this is an incredibly complex painting consisting of three planes in which we see represented women, many different women characters. In the first plane of the painting, we see 5 women being engaged in different labors associated with spinning. In the second plane of the painting, we see again 5 more women engaged in some kind of conversation or argument. And then finally, the tapestry displayed on the back wall. Just zoom my text. I use a summary of the interpretation of Velázquez's Hilanderas offered to us by influential scholars of this artist, Jonathan Brown, and also a summary provided by Museo de Prado, Javier Portus. This painting has been interpreted many times in different ways. As Javier Portus summarizes in his presentation, Velázquez's painting, originally thought to be a costumbrista depiction of a tapestry workshop, is now understood to be an exploration of a mythological theme and the several layers of messages conveyed through it. The first interpretation of the depiction of the argument between the goddess Athena and the mortal Arachne, in which the mortal is punished for her extraordinary ability to spin, was an admonishment against defying authority. Another interpretation has to do with the hidden hermeneutical reference to the painting by Rubens, that is in turn a copy of the painting by Titian, Had Athena deemed perfect in her spinning, Arachne would not have been able to compete and win against her. The message Velázquez's painting articulates has to do with the referentiality of art, but also, importantly, the ability of art to always progress, to always be subjected to new and different interpretations. So what do these multiple layers of meaning of Las Hilanderas suggest for our interpretation of Magon's 12th panel? And again, just to refresh our memories, now we identify this younger spinner here as Arachne, and then the more aged, modestly clothed spinner on the left as Athena, as the goddess Athena. It's important to point out that copies of works by Spanish painters were often used both in Spain, but also by New Spain artists in reference for studying, for recreating, for creating new versions of painting. So it is very likely that a New Spain artists were familiar both with work that was being done in New Spain, but also in the Iberian Peninsula. That if Magon was inspired by Velázquez's work, then which female figure did he represent in his painting? The depiction of Arachne seems likely at first, given the similarities in their clothing and style of hair. And I think that this is really what drew me to actually work with these two paintings together, was the very unusual correspondence between the dress of the two female protagonists, though they are represented from two different sides, one turning away, the other facing the viewer. However, in the back, in the second plane of Velázquez's painting, the scene that shows the argument between Athena and Arachne, as Athena, right here, raises her hand to punish Arachne, the shape of her raised hand is mirrored in the shape of the raised hand of Magon's spinner. In his own act of artistic defiance, Magon paints his cambuja as embodying both Arachne and Athena at the same time. Brilliantly, she encapsulates both the divine and the mortal, the young and the old, the indigenous and the African, the Americas and Europe. Cambuja's attire strongly signals her identification with Arachne, but her labor speaks otherwise. She is not winding thread as does Arachne. In Las Hilanderas, these preparatory tasks of working with material prima are carried out in Magon's composition by the child, the girl child. But the cambuja woman stands at the wooden spinning wheel as Athena is represented sitting in Velázquez's composition. Could Magon have made such a bold statement equating his racially mixed female spinner with the goddess of wisdom, war, and crafts in ancient Greek mythology, Athena? The answer lies in the very ambiguity and duplicity of visual references. The clothing, the hair, the humble origins of the cambuja equate her with the mortal Arachne, punished by the goddess for her arrogance. But her position at the spinning wheel and her labor of spinning itself suggest that she is continuing the labor of an ancient Greek female deity, just as she may be carrying out the work of ancient Nahua and Maya deities as well. Her left hand draws the thread, yet raised high in the air, the gesture mimics that of the goddess Athena in the moment of punishing Arachne, as depicted in the painting by Titian and repeated first by Rubens and then referenced in his painting by Velázquez. Conclusion. When considered in the light of cultural traditions, both pre-Hispanic Maya and Nahua mythologies and Western mythologies, including the ancient Greek and the Christian traditions, Casta paintings acquire new meanings. As works of art, they dialogue with other cultural texts. First, they are in conversation with other works of visual culture, namely the immediate works that the artists working in guilds would have studied and with which they would have been familiar. These included works by both European and Mexican painters, some of which they would have seen in original and some in copies, drawings, and imitations. Second, narrative texts, including those from mythologies, circulated both as oral stories and in printed forms. While religious painting was tightly regulated, secular forms of art gave opportunities to better one's painting skills by exploring a broader range of themes, characters, and storylines. Thinking of the Casta paintings solely as visual documents of a taxonomy prevents us from uncovering layers of meaning and expression. Finally, it is futile to think that Nahua cosmology and mythology did not have any presence in the work produced by local artists. It is a known fact that a number of the artists were of mestizo, indigenous, mulatto, and African descent. Depicting an act of spinning had profound meaning in pre-Hispanic and colonial indigenous societies, and the dialogue Magon's Spinner and Las Hilanderas by Diego Velázquez creates a web of storylines and possible interpretations. It is clear, however, that Magon did not paint a simple imitation of Velázquez's painting or its fragment, but rather he likely used it as an inspiration for creating his own female character, who, as a descendant of African, indigenous, and European blood, represented New Spain, and stands in a pose of defiance and gazes directly at the viewer. It is as though, in a contemplation of competing artistic traditions and different ways of striving towards perfection, the repeating narratives of defiance and punishment, and of capturing through the figure of the racially mixed female spinner the new path towards intellectual and artistic sophistication, America, her arm raised high, gazes back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evelina, for this wonderful talk in which you've dissected all these wonderful paintings for us, from analyzing them from so many different perspectives and showing us how they enter into conversation with one another and with canonical works by European artists like Velázquez. So it's a fascinating piece of research. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment. It's quite a lot to cover in a talk, and I appreciate your patience as we went through the different parts of this analysis. And of course, there's so much more to unpack. There's so many more details to go into in terms of the pre-Hispanic traditions that are not one-sided at all, and that can be looked from different angles as well. And of course, the tradition of painting in Viceregal New Spain or Mexico is also a complex tradition with many different expressions. Much of the art is religious in nature during the colonial period. So it's very interesting that many of the art historians look at religious art and analyze it and dissect it. And then other scholars look at Casta painting sort of as a very separate genre, which it is, but it's almost assumed that there's not a dialogue there at all. And I think if we start looking, and this is not the case with all Casta paintings, some of them indeed are different in the way that they're composed more as windows into the New Spain life and reality. But there are also very interesting cultural references. And considering that many of these artists were of mestizo background, of indigenous background, African background, what what do we see? What expressions of some of those cultures can we notice in these paintings? So that was the impetus behind this research.
Thank you. I wonder whether there are any questions. Would anybody like to ask a question from the audience? Yeah, I think, oh, well, there's somebody congratulating you. Yeah, so Joaquín Ribaya Martínez congratulates you. And he says, enhorabuena, la doctora Gužauskytė, por tan excelente presentación. And he says, I do have a question. Do we have an estimate of how many of these paintings were conceived to be sent to Europe as opposed to stay in the New World? And were there any significant differences between them in terms of content and style? That's a really very interesting question. Thank you, Joaquín.
Thank you very much for the question. This is a very good question, and I probably don't have a very specific answer, but you are absolutely right that some of them were created specifically to be sent back to Spain, to buyers, to collectors, to, in some cases, la nobleza, people of means, and in some cases, as we know with the archbishop, also representatives of the church. So there were many different customers of these paintings that may have commissioned the paintings. And you are absolutely right that we know that some of the paintings have been found rolled up and with this sort of elements that indicate that they were shipped, and that's what they were destined for. But in terms of the numbers of how many of them were shipped or not, and how many of them may have been produced for the audience, for local audiences, that's a hard question to answer. And maybe there is an answer, I just haven't found it yet. But it's true that these paintings are found today in very sometimes unlikely locations. And there are Casta paintings in the Canary Islands, for example, and there are examples of them in Great Britain, which you would not expect. And there are quite a few Casta paintings in the United States in different museums, but then again, they may have been purchased by these museums, like the Denver Museum in Colorado. They may have been purchased, not necessarily ended up there during the colonial era. So this question has come up in the past. To what extent might the buyer and the commissioner influence the content of the painting? And I think that's a fascinating question. And I think that goes right back at that tension of, where's the essence of the painting and who is creating the painting in a sense? Is it the desire for these images and sort of the desire for the quote unquote exotic, or is it more of a local expression, right? And so I think different interpretations have been provided by different critics in the past. For example, Katsu would argue that it's a local expression of pride, right? But also she suggested, and I agree, that there's not one interpretation that we need to stick with, and that they were produced throughout the century. There are at least 500 or more examples of Casta paintings that were produced from the beginning of the century all the way through the end and early 19th century. So they do differ in how and in what they communicate. And I think they are also received differently by us as viewers. And there are actually some, you are probably familiar, some wonderful examples of contemporary artists going back to these paintings and experimenting with the content and the messages in these paintings. And I believe the Museum of Art in Boston has a painting up and a response in poetry from a high school student who has a sort of a creative, personal response to the images. So I think they're still ongoing. There's still a very keen interest in what they offer.
in connection to Joaquin's question, I was wondering whether the image of breastfeeding in association with the Virgin, is that common in Spain? Because I'm not familiar with that image, but maybe that's my problem, my impression. So do you know whether it is so common in Spain and as it might be indicated by the painting you showed us?
And if I could ask a follow-up, are you referring to the images of breastfeeding in religious art or in
Yes.
secular art?
No, in religious art.
Religious art. There is a sort of a theme, as you are, as we're all familiar. The Virgin Mary is represented in so many themes or events of the Marian life. So you have scenes of the Assumption, you have scenes of the Immaculate Conception, different aspects of the Virgin Mary's life, and Virgin Mary represented with Christ child is one of the themes, but within it you may have the child being simply supported or held by the Virgin Mary, and in some cases also being breastfed as an infant. So it is a part of the tradition, and there are images of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding the child, and so it dialogues interestingly with the Casta paintings that represent breastfeeding, but also breastfeeding is also a very big topic within the realities of social life and the discussions that took place, not unlike today, about whether mothers should be breastfeeding their children or not, or if they should employ a nodriza. So there's a whole other aspect that stems from the life in the society that relates to breastfeeding. So you can read it both as an expression of social realities and pressures, but also as an artistic element.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Would anybody like to ask another question? We have a few minutes. No? I'd like to ask you, these categories that are shown at the in the paintings, the Casta paintings you showed, relating to the terms derived from the type of marriage, or couple, the Indio, Cambujanaste, Zambajiga, were those categories accepted at both sides of the Atlantic? Like, if the man is, I noticed that the man is Spanish, but the woman is mestiza or Indian, then the child is Spanish, but not the other way around, or something like that. Were they well-established categories at both sides of the Atlantic?
Thank you. Yeah, the nomenclature that is utilized in Casta paintings is a very bizarre and convoluted topic. And there seems to be an attempt to categorize and order the society based on these interracial categories, resulting from the mixing of the three major races that we see represented in Casta paintings, but the nomenclature itself is not consistent. From one painter to another, if you really look into there are some categories at the very beginning of the hierarchies that are consistent. So a union between an indigenous person and a white or Spanish person, the outcome, the offspring of that union would be called a mestizo or mestiza. That's consistent. But pretty much going from there on, all of the other categories, some of them appear again and again, but not necessarily in the same order. Castiza, cambuja, zambaiga, there are some terms that are derogatory, some terms are very uncomfortable and inappropriate, but they appear in a way that signals a desire to project an order, and yet that is never achieved, because you go from one casta set to another, and the order is different, and the names are different, and the choice of representing this particular union or that particular union is a different one. So there's some consistencies, but there's absolutely not a consistency in terms of establishing that this is because this is a society we're talking about, right? There's no definite way of defining people and their offspring, that this is an organic, complex society. So this is a very peculiar sort of document that gives us a glimpse into a society, and also, as in the previous question, an audience that wanted to see certain things explained, categorized, but this effort ultimately is absolutely futile, and this is why in the end casta paintings fall out of fashion. And this happens with the coming of the independence movements, and by the early 19th century, they cease to be produced.
Well, I think this is a very nice statement to round up your talk, Evelina. So thank you very much. It's been wonderful. We've learned a lot, and we've really enjoyed these paintings, which are absolutely wonderful and beautiful, and deep too, aren't they? They have so many different layers of meaning and of representation. So thank you so much for bringing them to us and open our eyes to them.
Really appreciate the invitation, and again, I appreciate everyone who stayed here with me this beautiful afternoon, at least in Boston. So again, thank you for your presence, for your questions and support, and please feel free to write to me, to my Wellesley address, if you have further questions or suggestions. I would welcome your feedback.
Okay, so thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming. See you soon again in another event, and thank you, Evelina. Thank you again.